This is Justice Worriers, a podcast where we think about things that are right and wrong in our world and how Christian ideas can help us respond to them. We prefer hard questions over easy answers, and we'd love you to join us in our ramblings. Listen in and contact us using the links in the show notes. Hello and welcome to Justice Worriers, episode 47. My name's Andy, and as usual I'm joined by Leah. Say hi, Leah.
Hi there.
And Jörg. Say hi, Jörg.
Hello.
Hello. So forgive us if we've completely forgotten how to do a podcast. It seems like ages since we've done this. But, we've been thinking a lot in the meantime about how the whole world's falling apart and there's disaster everywhere. And even if we don't all kill each other, then climate change will come along and finish us off. So we thought, on that happy note, Leah, you brought something for us to talk about this evening.
Yeah, so I'm speaking on Sunday night at church from Isaiah chapter 35. So shall I read it out?
Yes, please.
So it starts in the opposite vein to Andy, the joy of the redeemed. The desert. What was that? Was that a joyous shout?
Yeah, looking forward to it. Yeah, sure.
Okay, or was that a scoff? The desert and the parched land will be glad. The wilderness will rejoice and blossom like the crocus. It will burst into bloom. It will rejoice greatly and shout for joy. The glory of Lebanon will be given to it, the splendour of Carmel and Sharon. They will see the glory of the Lord, the splendour of our God. Strengthen the feeble knees, steady the knees that give way. Say to those with fearful hearts, be strong, do not fear. Your God will come. He will come with vengeance, with divine retribution. He will come to save you. Then will the eyes of the blind be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then will the lame leap like a deer, and the mute tongue shout for joy. Water will gush forth in the wilderness, and streams in the desert. The burning sand will become a pool, the thirsty ground bubbling springs. In the haunts where jackals once lay, grass and reeds and papyrus will grow. And a highway will be there. It will be called the way of holiness. It will be for those who walk on that way. The unclean will not journey on it. Wicked fools will not go about on it. No lion will be there, nor any ravenous beast. They will not be found there. But only the redeemed will walk there, and those the Lord has rescued will return. They will enter Zion with singing. Everlasting joy will crown their heads. Gladness and joy will overtake them, and sorrow and sighing will flee away.
Good.
Yeah, so there you go. And I think that the first thing to say is that I've found it really hard in church recently with all that's going on in Israel and Lebanon and Gaza and Palestine and all the things that you hear. And then we then talk about stuff from the Bible as if it's kind of some sort of all alternate reality with no kind of acknowledgement that these are actual real places that we're reading about. I don't know. Is that just me? Maybe we can just, there was a sermon the other week talking about kind of the Good Samaritan and the road to Jericho. And I was like, I don't know. I just find it hard to talk in that way without just one little moment of acknowledgement. But maybe I'm being oversensitive.
I know what you mean. I think in some ways it, just the mention of the names of places feels painful, and maybe that's because I have a sense of not really engaging with what's going on in the world sometimes, and I don't know, or maybe I just think that whenever I hear stuff in church, it takes me straight back to my childhood where I wasn't engaged with any of this stuff. And it was like an alternate reality, and it didn't really matter what would happen in the world, because all that mattered was that you believed the right stuff so that you went to heaven. And so, it brings me straight back to that. When I hear that name Lebanon in that passage, it just makes me think, we're living in a fantasy land. We're not engaging with what's really happening.
I think it's even a bit worse in that these texts have produced the reality we're living in today. I have a problem with the prepositions here. I don't know who they are. Well, I think I know who they are. I don't quite know who it is in the beginning. But so I just opened up Bible commentary, just any old one I found, and this happens to be one I don't think I agree with. But it says this about the first verses. The wilderness and the wasteland shall be glad for them. The deserts shall rejoice and blossom as the rose. It says, this promise was true in the immediate term when Judah was restored after the invasion of the Assyrians was turned back. And this promise is true in the longer term as modern-day Israel has turned the wilderness and the wasteland into productive farms and has truly made the desert blossom as the rose.
Ooh, ouch.
And this promise will be true in the ultimate fulfillment of this prophecy when God restores the ecology of the world after the end of the Great Tribulation and the Battle of Armageddon. And
wow,
this is not untypical of the way that we've learned to read these passages in certain evangelical circles, is that they spell out a universal history rather than a very particular moment in time of Israel reckoning with its bleak future surrounded first by the Assyrians and later the Babylonians. And these verses have developed sort of a logic of their own, and you can hear that. I was in Israel once. It was an incredibly important trip. I think we went there as students. We had sort of prepared the archaeological seminars, and we were kind of led. And this was before the Second Intifada. It was a time when you could imagine that things could turn out differently. There was a huge amount of difference. There was some hate, but actually we lived in Western Jerusalem, like in the area of the old Intifada. We looked out on the Kidron Valley, you could walk through there. It was just a completely different time. No walls, no nothing. And even then, our tour guide would continuously tell us there was nothing here before we came. We made this land bloom. And you could drive in your tour bus from this land, which allegedly bloomed by itself. When you looked a bit closer, there was watering hoses everywhere. And you could just drive 20 kilometers and suddenly you're in an area where there's a Palestinian child plowing after a donkey. And it just this sort of contrast between the reality and this ideology present was horrific in a sense. And I think we're seeing where it's led us.
Yeah, so just to translate that slightly, that mention of the kind of unambiguous good of the Israeli state, it glosses over the complexity, at the very least, of the establishment of that state, and also the incredibly painful and violent situation in that area of the world that's going on at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is really not at all for me a criticism of Israel in any, that this is really not anything I would want to be engaging in. But the question that I have is where nationalism has led us to, and to what extent the biblical nationalism from a very, very different time, a different era, a different way in which societies organize themselves into modern nation states has just become so harmful, and these Bible texts aren't innocent in that process.
And I think, unfortunately, the Bible texts end up doing more than just playing into nationalism, and I think we've talked before about problems with nationalism in the Bible, haven't we? But unfortunately, they also then get interpreted in certain ways that is essentially Christians seeing a logic of God's action. So God is punishing, God is restoring, God is doing this, God is doing that. And kind of, it's okay then to be the vehicle of that judgment or the vehicle of that punishment. And so it's like we can justify, I don't know, America acting in a certain way towards Israel because that's kind of part of that's America implementing God's plan for the restoration of Israel, So not only do we take these texts and sort of use them to reinforce nationalism, we also kind of create these slightly weird stories that may or may not be how the world's going to end up, right? I mean,
yes.
Who knows if we're taking what should be taken literally and what should be taken figuratively? But there's this, you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I meant by we turn them into universal stories when they were particular ones. I mean, if you transport yourself back into the time, and Isaiah comes in 3 different books written at different times, that's what biblical scholars say. This one, oh goodness, I think this is still Proto-Isaiah, but so the first part, but I'm going to look it up real quick before I say something. This is still Proto-Isaiah. It's toward the end of Proto-Isaiah, which is basically about announcing disaster. And then this is followed, so Proto-Isaiah runs from chapter 1 to 39. Deutero-Isaiah, so second Isaiah, is runs from chapter 40 to 55, which is the work of an anonymous exilic author. And Trito-Isaiah, the third of Isaiah, is sort of an even later anthology of about 12 passages, which are all about sort of restoration and return. So what we're looking at here is sort of coming toward the end of a book that announces judgment when the exile hasn't yet happened. So this is Judah reckoning with the sort of appearing geopolitical horizon. So Israel has already been destroyed, and the enemies are coming closer, but it's before Babylonian captivity. And then later they have to reckon with Babylonian captivity. This is where a lot of the famous passages of Isaiah are, which also has to do with sort of redemptive death and sort of punishment, and then the promise of restoration, all from the exilic time. But this is really still a cloudy time for them, but before the exile.
So this is a time where there's a big threat on the horizon.
A big threat on the horizon, and Leah, I think in your sermon draft, you were already pointing toward that this is actually part of a passage of announcing wrath on the nations and sort of announcing that God will punish them and then he will restore them, but you still have to go through the battle. So that's what we're looking at here. But again, the point was, this is a very specific point in Israel's time, and by universalizing it, we have, or not necessarily we, but a number of interpreters have then turned this into quite different stories, which I find not very helpful.
Those that die by wearing the badge, they're the chosen ones. Those who died are justified for wearing the badge, they're the chosen ones. The justified, those that died, they're the chosen ones.
But it feels quite relatable to be not yet in those crisis times, but with a big threat on the horizon. Obviously, a lot of people in the world are currently facing the crisis right now, but for me, it feels more like things are looming.
And I think that's sort of how I came at the passage, really. If as Jörg says, we shouldn't take it as a universal story about restoring Israel, but then what does it have to say to us? And I think we've all listened now to the Nomad podcast with Brian McLaren. I haven't yet read his recent book, but I'd like to. And I think a number of the things I've kind of come at with this, it was just, sometimes you think maybe God is in stuff, because I was all set last Saturday that I had loads of work to do and I had this talk to prepare. So I was going to sit down for the whole of Saturday and just get stuff done. And then last Saturday was like the most beautiful, beautiful day. Like the sky was just like this amazing blue, and it was, I thought, I cannot sit in front of the laptop all Saturday. So I decided I'd go for a walk and I'd listen to a podcast. And it was like, when you listen to something and somebody who's a much better speaker than you, just like, you go, yes, oh, I was going to say that. No, you've like taken what I was going to say and you've like encapsulated it really, really well. So it was great because it kind of gave me some ideas, and maybe God led me to listen to a podcast.
So that's Nomad episode 329.
Yes.
And it's called Wisdom and Courage for a World Falling Apart, which I think is also the name of his book, I think.
Something like that, yeah.
His book is along those lines, yeah. And I think one thing I really wanted to acknowledge was that for us, as you say, Andy, it does feel like there's looming crisis and multiple different crises. But for some people in history and now, life is permanently in crisis, and we should recognise that our privileged position, that our lives by and large are kind of, well, they're okay. We do fine, and it's good to start by remembering that for many people life is permanent crisis, and there's not been a beginning and an end to that. Yeah,
and also for other people there's the world ends, right? Like, and this is the kind of phrase that Brian McLaren uses, that he talks about societies whose entire world has ended, whether he's talking about indigenous societies where their way of life has been destroyed. But it also struck me, thinking about that there are plenty of people, even in safe, prosperous Western places, for whom their world ends as in they die, but also as in they go through crises which don't affect everyone in their society, but they still affect them in catastrophic ways. So in some sense, the idea that we're far away from, that we're safe from that kind of crisis is not really realistic. You never know when illness or accident even, or something else will cause something that feels like the end of the world, or is the end of your life.
I think one thing that resonated with me from that podcast, and maybe connects also quite well with our discussions here, is he kind of draws these different these different development scenarios, also in the face of sort of global crises like climate change, and kind of makes the argument for the most likely and perhaps the most beneficial scenario for humanity is going through the crisis and learning from it. That seems to have been our history, that we evolve through pain and suffering and war. And then he reminds his listeners in the podcast that actually a lot of the sort of meditative practices or different monastic orders, they actually bloom in those times. Whereas, sometimes it to us can seem like this kind of luxury, mindfulness, de-stress your life. But actually he says, well, this is not what it was at all. It wasn't luxury. This is people who were so taken out of their world by what they saw around them. These were violent times in which then these monastic orders arose or bloomed. So it was a very hopeful message of say, well, there's always the horizon of a better humanity, and the nuggets of that are already within us if we settle down and sort of listen inwardly. And the thing that I struggle with here is when you listen to, I've listened to a lot of Ezra Klein, for example, on Israel-Palestine, and I think it's an amazing podcast because he lets all sides speak, and they're intellectuals, and you really understand the sort of depths of the issue. And you understand the pain on both sides. I think that's also very important to acknowledge, because the conflict has become so asymmetrical now that quite rightly we find it hard to see the pain that Israel is going through as well, and the sort of trauma that has led to this kind of violence. And what I'm struggling with here is, how can you imagine, even from this far away, that there is a future of embrace in that region? That there is another way in which people can actually learn to live together. And sometimes you see these nuggets of hope, like last night at BBC News, they were interviewing some people who had fled Lebanon, and some said, like, I'm just sad. This is politics. We don't live this way. I felt well here forever. This isn't us. And that to me was like a tiny glimmer of hope that people are saying, well, they weren't even laying blame. They weren't even saying, oh, the Jews are doing this or something. It wasn't couched in these sort of ethnocentric terms. They were just saying, this is politics. Somebody is feeding on our hate, and this isn't us. And I wish there were more stories like this. And we would hear more stories like this, because they did happen. We know they happened on October 7th. And we know, we've seen on the news how Israelis are protesting against the extremely brutal way in which this war has been conducted. And yeah, maybe there's a way of bringing that more to the fore as a way of actually understanding or imagining the land blooming in a very different fashion than what you can hear in these texts of like one nation making the land bloom.
I mean, it's funny, isn't it? Because I didn't kind of take the texts like that much at all. But you're absolutely right. It is in there. And I felt you couldn't really read chapter 35 without reading the chapter before, because they very much seem to all be part of a narrative. And I don't know, I could pull out just a couple of things that I...
So just before you do that, Leo, I just want to clarify.
Helpful, but yeah, do you want to...
I just want to clarify that, like, what you're talking about, Jörg, and potentially you, Leah, as well, is that this chapter 35 that we've read, you're reading it as essentially someone saying we're gonna eventually be victorious and kill all of our enemies.
Yes. What I'm unsure about is, who are they?
Right.
Who's it that will bloom?
Yeah.
Is it the desert will bloom? Whose desert? In Lebanon? The cedars of Lebanon will be given to it. They will come to Zion. In the world that this text was written in, there was no doubt that this was not a universal hope. I mean, this kind of universalism of salvation emerges in Trito Isaiah, if at all, and right. Even there, and in also later Jeremiah, and even there, it is written as a way of all the people will gather into Zion. So it's an imagined future where everybody will come to see Israel's God. And gather into their vision of society, and so I'm reading these passages and in their context as quite nationalist ones, and that's probably the wrong way to put it, because these weren't nation states, but they were this kind of
right
ethnocentric. We are the chosen people. Yes, we allow converts, but
we're scared, but eventually we're going to be all right. All right, sorry, Leah, go on then. Do our context.
No, I think it's hard, isn't it? Because maybe I'm taking it out of context and seeing it as too, and not seeing it like that. I don't know, but I think if you go back the chapter, there's this sense of a giving over. The Lord is angry with all nations. His wrath is on all their armies. He will totally destroy them. He will give them over to slaughter, in a kind of a sort of, just if armies are going to fight each other, then there's this horrible sense of just let them get on with it, which is horrible, but is also not particularly favouring one side. And then what emerges later in the chapter is initially chaos and like horrible consequences for nature. Streams will be turned into pitch, dust into burning sulfur. The land will lie desolate. But then actually a coming back of softness and care. The owl will nest there and lay eggs. She will hatch them and care for her young. The falcons will gather. No one will lack a mate. And then I'd read this as like a bringing back of a different kind of order. An order where the strong and the powerful aren't in charge anymore.
Yeah, no lion will be there.
Yeah. And then coming into the chapter that we read, obviously you've got the bits about the strengthening the feeble and the lame and the...
Yeah.
And I felt if you then saw the bit at the end, which is about there will be a highway and a way of holiness, that does sound very exclusive. It feels different if you read it in the perspective of a highway of safety for the weak who were being squashed. But yeah, as ever, you can read it. You can read it both ways.
Yeah, and with my kind of universalist tendencies, I really struggle with things like, the wicked will not be there or something like that, because it immediately makes me go to like, now they're outsiders and insiders. But I think there's another way of reading it. I think it's so poignant to read this passage in the week when Russia poisoned the Ukrainian river. And it's just so present in our reality right now that war causes this kind of desolation and destruction. And if you read that line about the wicked will not walk on it, wicked fools will not go about on it, is what it says about this way of holiness. If you read it as like, I don't know, I guess if you take wickedness seriously, which you're forced to do when you think about what's happening in war, then banishing wickedness is a good and important thing, and not just some kind of, we have to have an insiders and outsiders club, but it's like we need to learn lessons from our sins, or whatever, however you want to put it.
Yeah. A footnote to the nations, which isn't going to be helpful, but maybe helpful in a different way. The Hebrew word is goyim, which is essentially Gentiles. So Israel is not a nation.
Sorry, where's this from?
In chapter 34, where it says the Lord is angry with all nations.
Oh, okay, right.
It's
just the Gentiles, isn't it?
It's the Gentiles.
That's kind of spoiled your point, Lou.
It has, isn't it?
Yeah, that's why I was hesitating. But here's my branch. Again, looking at in context, you are an extremely weak city-state almost. You're occupying a small area around Jerusalem. The much stronger tribes to the north, who you think are your ancestral brothers, if only they could be convinced to worship like you do, i.e. the state of Israel, or the tribes of Israel, have already succumbed to this power. They have already surrounded you. They have boasted about King Hezekiah being like in a golden cage. They've only survived the siege just barely through digging the Hezekiah tunnel that you can still visit in Jerusalem today. That's the place they're in. And now you can imagine that God is bringing those stronger nations upon you as a way to punish you. And in that sense, the passage gives you peace and hope and says, no, God is angry at them. He's not using them as a tool. He's not into this violence and destruction. This isn't supposed to happen this way. And I mean, this is basically what it was. It was extraction. It was a much larger neighbor, making sure you pay your tribute and becoming a sort of regional hegemon. And if you stood up to them, you were eradicated. And Judah sort of didn't want to do that. For various reasons, probably including some ritual aspects. So, in a way, it is still a similar message. God is not with those who conduct violence. God is not with those who subdue. God is not persecuting you through them. And in fact, he'll find a way through it. So just as a way to kind of heal the the crack that I've ripped open there.
Yeah. Bring it back round. Thanks.
But yeah, that message of sometimes it's a message of people's immoral actions are coming back on them now, and that's what the pain that people are experiencing. But sometimes with a passage like this, it's more like, this evil stuff won't last forever, and eventually things will be set straight, kind of thing.
Mm.
Is that how the world does work?
One wishes, right? Although there's a lot of violence for those violent bringers. I mean, you can understand how in a moment where you're faced with this threat, you revel in this. They're slain, I'm reading from chapter 34, verse 3. Their slain will be thrown out, their dead bodies will stink, the mountains will be soaked with their blood. All the stars in the sky will be dissolved and the heavens rolled up like a scroll. All the starry hosts will fall like withered leaves from the vine. I mean, you imagine that this violence is bringing the end of the world, but God is bringing the end of the world forward. And I'm really torn in two about this language, because on the one hand, this apocalyptical language is exactly the stuff that the people who preach warfare will also use to say, well, this is going to have to happen so that Jesus can come back again. Mm. But a different reading of it will actually say, no, look, this is what violence reaps. Mm. The destruction of your universe, the stars rolling up like a scroll, the filaments of the heavens just being disturbed by all that you do.
Don't you think Jesus was trying to tell people not to do that kind of, there has to be war, there has to be this happen, there has to be that happen, when he talks about you won't know the day or time? I mean, I know, again, there's another specific bit of context that we're universalizing, I guess, because was he specifically talking about the destruction of Jerusalem or something?
And it's worth noting that his message hasn't healed human proclivity toward apocalypticism. We have the Apocalypse of John, which is then read in similar ways, of this, and in some ways welcoming destruction in the interpretation some days. So I don't know. And even Jesus would say things like, this not one stone will be left on each, like announcing the destruction of Jerusalem, which again, the thing about apocalyptic literature is actually it's always meant to explain the present. We've talked about this in a previous podcast, but we then make it about the future in later years. And actually, if you were reading the words of Jesus, let's say 80, 90, like in the year 90, the image of the destroyed temple to Jerusalem 20 years prior is still very much alive. And then you take comfort in the fact that this wasn't meant to happen. Mm. But when you read it as an announcement, you say, bring on the destruction so that the next thing can happen. And that's exactly not what apocalyptical literature is meant to do.
I think this has made me think about another thing we've talked about Jesus on previous podcasts, and given me a different perspective. I think previously we talked about how Jesus was basically refusing to stand up to empire, right? And saying, no, you just... I don't know, you just take it or whatever. I don't know what we thought he was saying, but something that's felt too passive in the face of this evil empire. But in this context, when we're looking at wars that seem inescapable, especially in Israel, Gaza, Lebanon, Palestine, Iran situation, Yemen, it just feels like there's no path to peace. And in that context, Jesus saying, no, refuse to fight, feels a much more, something I can get behind a bit more.
Because the fighting just feels like it'll forever beget fighting.
Yeah, it's just getting worse and worse, yeah.
Yeah, that's a real crucial thing here, isn't it? I mean, we talked about this a little bit before, it's one thing to understand the psychology of lashing out. And even to some extent, the recent developments toward Lebanon, if you live in northern Israel and you've had to leave your villages and your houses because it's completely unlivable because rockets come over every day. That's one thing to understand that. It's quite another thing to say that's something of a strategy or to imagine where that will lead, because all you can see is just further bloodletting. Like, what would Hezbollah suddenly say, well, okay, then we give up, you guys win. It's clearly 2-1 or something. So therefore we've lost this. That's never going to happen. But I don't know. I mean, I wish that I would have the strength in a moment like that to say, like Jesus did, yes, come and kill me, because I trust that there will be life in the end, if that is the message of cross and resurrection. But it's another thing to demand that of somebody else. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think truly none of us know how we would respond at all. And I guess that is the direction I've ended up kind of heading with my talk, and I've tried to escape the Old Testament and jump into the New because it's slightly easier. But so because those verses 3 and 4, strengthen the feeble hands, steady the knees that give way, are pretty much verbatim quoted in Hebrews. So obviously writing to people for whom this was their sacred scripture, right? Isaiah. So it didn't feel like too much of a stretch to jump there. And I was thinking about, and it's the bit in Hebrews after the great chapter that lists all those heroes of the faith. And I was wanting to broaden that a little bit and think about just heroes of kind of pacifist resistance, in that all the people since then who have given their lives for the greater good, you could imagine them all being kind of part of this great roll call that there is in Hebrews of kind of be encouraged, strengthen the feeble hands, steady the knees, because this is what other people have done, and this is how other people have given themselves. And it talks about you're surrounded by this great host of witnesses. And I thought, well, here's a people, if you go back to all the heroes of faith that are pointed, who didn't even necessarily believe in the afterlife, but they were looking for something bigger, something more than themselves, something greater. They were part of an ongoing story. I'm not sure if I'm explaining this very well.
I think you're spot on.
Can I hear where I'm going?
I think you're spot on. First of all, I would say this passage is also not about the afterlife. This is not within Isaiah.
No, none of it's about the afterlife.
And even in Ezekiel, the bones will be gathered and all of that. That too is more like a metaphor of the restoration of Israel than what it then became in sort of grave culture or something.
I love that bones bit. And when I love it because of the idea that humans can be restored and healed, and societies can be restored and healed, but like on earth, I don't see it as like a heavenly thing. Yeah,
it's not taken up and like the spirit blowing on earth and saving them. But the other thing that's just struck me listening to you and reading the verse that you just cited at the beginning of, maybe let me read it out. So strengthen the feeble hands, steady the knees that give way, say to those with fearful hearts, be strong, do not fear, your God will come. But then it says, he will come with vengeance, with divine retribution. He will come to save you. But now listen to the next verse. Then will the eyes of the blind be opened and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then will the lame leap like a deer and the mute tongue shout for joy. Water will gush forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. So God's divine retribution isn't at all what we just read in chapter 34. Like his anger with the nations is that's the thing that brings destruction is human iniquity, is human violence. And God's retribution is if anything, this will play out, but there will be new life.
Writing that down for my sermon. Sorry, you're making that one.
There's a great Gungor song, where they talk about they turn all that stuff. Let me find the lyrics.
Yeah, I think I've just written in my talk that it's the weak, the disabled, and the fearful that will recover. I don't have an easy answer for why they don't. Yeah, and the wounded, and yes, exactly. It's the weakened landscape, the destroyed. I don't have an easy answer for why they don't get to escape the judgment, but they're not forgotten. God's not on the side of the powerful waiting to see who will come out on top. The God of the broken and the weak.
Here we go. So this is the Gungor song, His Judgment is Love. And then some select lyrics from it. See, a kingdom comes to us, a war that's fought with love. Our only war is love. Prepare the way of the Lord, wielding mercy like a sword. Every mountaintop will be made low. No, he holds the earth like dust, and his judgment comes to us, and his judgment is love. And so on and so on. And I love the way it uses that language to express the values that Jesus expressed. And it feels, the reason I love it is because there's a logic to it that feels true, but that we've completely missed sometimes when we read that language without understanding the character that God and Jesus are displaying through the Bible. If you read it holistically and not just for little bits.
And if I connect this back to some of the stuff we were talking about, the sort of what are signs of hopefulness? Let's assume for a moment that the Bible is written by humans. It's a beautiful sign that they don't get stuck on the vengefulness, on the horrific violence, but that the imagination of the time after is not to wallow in somebody else's blood,
right?
But a healed earth, the broken mended, the burning sands become a pool, the thirsty grounds like bubbling spring, where jackals once were, grass, reeds, and papyrus will grow. So there's something deep within us that cries out for justice, mercy, and not for domination, hate, violence.
This is so upbeat.
Even just
this is so upbeat.
I know, it's out of character. But I think there is always that residue of hope. I can't reconcile it with reality as we see it.
Yeah.
But I also cannot imagine a humanity that will completely give in to violence and will not sing songs about a better future where enemies are reconciled, where mothers have children and see them grow up, where fruit just grows on trees and doesn't get cut down. Just that is what's in us.
Yeah, and you always see it. There is. I think of those horrible race riots we had a few months ago. There were some. I think we talked about it on the podcast, but there's some amazing stories that came out, and all sorts of situations. People put their lives on the line for one another, in ways that you wouldn't expect.
And it's a peaceful vision as well as the earth recovering, or maybe the reason why the earth's recovering is because there's peace.
Yeah.
And there isn't a pile of bodies in the river.
And it even turns into something universal here that no longer talks of the nations. If you go further down in verse 8, and a highway will be there. It will be called the way of holiness. It will be for those who walk on that way. The unclean will not journey on it. Wicked fools will not go about on it. No lion will be there, no ravenous beast. They will not be found there, but only the redeemed will walk there. And those the Lord has rescued will return. I want to read this as a sign toward universalism. I don't know, one would have to dig into the Hebrew to see if that's actually true, but it doesn't talk about the nations or the people of Israel as a contrast, but the unclean versus those of holiness, the wicked versus those who walk the way. So there is even a sort of a universalizing future here that actually says, well, humans can be different, and we can actually recognize the good rather than just tribal instincts.
On the universalism thing, you're going to probably destroy my hopes here again, Jörg, but at the end of the previous chapter, I noticed this strange bit about... So there's a bit about the owl. This is verse 15 of chapter 34. The owl will nest there, and lay eggs. She will catch them and care for her young. And then look in the scroll of the Lord and read, none of these will be missing, not one will lack her mate. And then this thing about he allots their portions, his hand distributes them by measure. They will possess it forever and dwell there from generation to generation. Now, do you take that's talking about the owl and the falcons, about the wild creatures that have kind of made this their home? That there's, or is that they referring back to the people? Because that he allots their portions, his hand distributes them by measure, is very much kind of how God kind of gave out the land to the Israelites when they first kind of inhabited the promised land, you know? So is it saying that there's a new order coming into being here that puts nature and the weaker first and not just, I don't know.
It's a weird break between chapter 15 and verse 15 and verse 16 there, but I would have to leave this to scholars who've debated that. Like, I really don't know.
Yeah.
You could find it in a commentary. It's weird.
It's interesting though, isn't it? It is weird.
It's all making me think of a book series that I read called the Broken Earth Trilogy by N.K. Jemisin, which is this amazing series. I highly recommend it, listener. And it's set in this world which is hostile to humans. Humans are just about surviving. And the Earth is broken, and the Earth is basically like turned on humanity. It's a kind of magical world, but it's basically like a post-climate disaster world. And there's no that world is extremely bleak, and there's no coming back. And what's beautiful about this passage in the context of all of our fears is that it is expressing a faith that the earth will be restored, and that is like a symbol of humans being restored, or I think it's not even a symbol of it. I think I lack the cultural ability to recognize that it's just one and the same, right? That the earth being restored is the same as humanity being restored. That's beautiful, but also just the idea of having this imagination, like you said, Jörg, for not just for vengeance and for defeating our enemies, but for this much deeper and better peace.
Well, and that they are, in our imagination, they are linked. You know, like maybe we're not used to sort of thinking explicitly about this, but what do you see in any sort of film that is apocalyptical in the future? It's always a destroyed Earth, like the sort of surrounding, you know, like that's what signals the destruction. What do you see in Utopia? You know, even if it's just small, you see a sunrise, you see some sort of beautiful nature. Like in our imagination, healed Earth is very much connected. The abundance of resources, the growing of nature, the predictability of nature. I mean, like that's why that novel that you just mentioned works with this destroyed Earth, right?
I mean, it's even there in like poppies and the growing on the killing fields, right?
Yes, exactly, yeah. Even the poppy symbolism, for all its politics, it has that in it.
Yeah.
I wish we could see it though. It's a leap of faith, isn't it? It just, oh my goodness.
So is that where I'm wondering where we're going with this episode? Is where we're going like how to join with the writer of this passage in having a vision or the imagination for this peace restoration?
I think also where we're going is, and it was a Brian McLaren quote that I wrote down. A little bit like Jörg mentioned, we don't know how we would behave if we were in these extreme situations, but he said, hope is that I don't know how things are going to turn out, but my hope is that I can turn up as a courageous, kind and wise person in the midst of it. However things turn out, there are some things worth being and some things worth doing. I found that incredibly, incredibly powerful, and I feel like those descriptions in Hebrews 12 of what people went through and what we see in heroic stories, from whether it's from this students in Hong Kong or the people in Myanmar that are still fighting a brutal dictatorship, whether it's the women in Iran who have protested against having to wear head covering, whether it's women in Afghanistan, all these.
Yeah, and also like parents of someone who was kidnapped on October 7th calling for peace.
Absolutely. Yeah. Humans have this amazing ability to, and I think as evangelical Christians, we deflect that all the time with this wretched obsession with heaven.
Yeah.
Because because if you just think about me as an individual, it's kind of like I'm doing good because then I get to heaven. And
or not even doing good, right? Just believing the right thing.
Oh yeah, no, just believing the right stuff. But it's how do we reclaim that sense of community that we might not see the benefits of turning up, like he said, and doing the right thing. We might not see those benefits for ourselves. We might not see them for our own children. Might not even see them for our friends and family. But are we still forming the character in our lives that means that we can turn up in those ways for the greater, bigger good of the kingdom or community or whatever.
So can we invest into the world some tiny bit of goodness in the hope that if even a tiny group of humans survives some kind of apocalypse, that we will have had some positive influence on their life, and that their life will be slightly more beautiful because of how we behaved.
Yeah, but also just not living under the sign of the apocalypse or under escapism, but to do this as sort of little acts of rebellion to sow hope and friendliness to those around us. I mean, when you asked where is this episode going, my first reaction was, well, the first point was where Leah started. Enough of the escapism, enough of reading those Bible passages as if they have nothing to do with today.
Right.
We are looking at destruction, and here I'm meant to preach a message of hope, of restoration. So let's first of all talk about what we're looking at and why this message of hope and restoration still resonates. And then secondly, to just take away sort of these kind of what's the opposite of microaggression? Micro-kindnesses?
Random acts of kindness, people call
Random acts of kindness. So just to kind of say, well, there is another story. There is another vision that lives inside all of us. And what happens, like you and I are not going to change what happens in Israel, Gaza, Lebanon, Palestine. It's important to make our voices heard. Yes, it's important to remain politically engaged, but it's equally important to remain realistic about what is in our powers. But what is in our powers is just to still say uplifting things to people around us, to not be completely absorbed. Again, not in an escapist manner. It's very hard to hit the balance there, but to also not be completely absorbed by it and say, well, let's look at what beautiful vision of humanity still is in humans. I recently had to go on a flight to the US, a very late evening flight, and there was a medical emergency before we got going, so it was like 2 hours on the tarmac, and we almost weren't allowed to go. And it was horrific how tense the flight was, and how people were treating one another like stupid little things, just fighting over like room in the overhead compartments and just things like that. And I just thought, like, I know life is hard right now, and I know this is not where we all want to be, but this is not making it better. We don't need this. And then just trying to be friendly to people around you, like almost to the point, making that the point of saying, like, just be counter situational in a way. Because we are holding on to a vision that isn't going to die, even if we all die. This, even in our literature and our AI will survive the notion of, ecological paradise and peace and harmony, because that's who we are. That's what we are. Maybe that is an imprint of the cosmos in us.
Yeah, I'm brought back to zombie movies again, which I often think about, and most of the zombie movies and TV series that I like are about people trying to behave with humanity when the awful thing has already happened, right? And so, like, this idea of like facing the fact that we might not be able to stop the bad thing, but saying, but I'm still gonna be as human as I can be, whatever's happening, even if I'm the last human.
And I think Jörg's example is a trivial but good one, because sometimes there can be kind of a hero culture in Christianity, or we look up to these great heroes of the faith who did an amazing stuff in difficult circumstances, but that kind of character is only ever the result of lots and lots of late flights to America where everyone's being grotty about the overhead lockers, aren't they? Those the ability to behave in that way, the character that's been formed in those real testing circumstances has been formed by lots and lots of little occasions where we choose to act humanely and kindly when it would be easy not to, because if we can't do it in the small things, we won't do it in the big things.
And even if it doesn't lead us to heroic epics about our lives,
that's not the point. That's not the point, right?
Exactly. The point is that whether we're true to the seed of divine power in us, which is about life springing forth. I mean, that's the imprint in our universe. That's what we feel in our bodies as soon as we're sexually mature. That's what we see in our visions of environments. Like, it's life. It's the next generation. It's not destruction. It's growth.
I've never heard you so upbeat, Jörg. Is it because I started off on such a low?
I think that's it.
I should try that more often.
Yeah, maybe, yeah.
Maybe because I gave in to the whole, everything's awful at the beginning.
Maybe it's something the tea I've been drinking. Yeah, let's...
Anyway, that's an interesting chapter. We'll see how the talk goes on Sunday.
Yeah. It'll be interesting. I don't envy you to preach on such a locally relevant piece of passage. But kudos for actually trying to bring it back and connect it to what we're seeing, because it's so often done in a wrong way, in universalizing the story.
All right, so even when I die, flowers will grow on my grave, right?
It's that kind of thing, yeah.
So that's what you're saying. So if I'm too positive, you bring death. Is that?
But yeah, I mean, maybe that is another aspect of it, right? That it's not just that humans see, have a vision and see a time of peace and flourishing. It's also that we see it in nature, even when humans do their worst. We see nature reclaiming and regrowing.
Yeah, and I mean, let's go as pessimistic as we can be, and say within X amount of time, this will be another dead planet. Like the old joke, where one planet says to another, "Oh, I'm not feeling well. I got humans all over my skin," and the other planet goes, "Don't worry, that'll go away." Let's imagine that's the case. Will the story be destruction? No, it will be that life springs forward in the universe all the time, and that species like ours evolve all the time. That there's sort of this love toward complexity, and at some point, the civilization will get further. So, even in the sort of most pessimistic scenario, the big story is still the one of hope and of life.
And the little story is what matters, what I can influence is how I behave in my part of that story, whatever its ending.
Yeah. And those beautiful acts of kindness will not be forgotten. Like, they might be forgotten, but they still have happened. They're not erasable, and that's, yeah.
Maybe that's what faith is. Thinking what you just said, right? That that kindness and good things that we do, in some sense, exist and persist.
That's the story of the resurrection for me. I mean, that's what I felt like. Jesus' resurrected body is almost like a haunting of goodness, right? Like this, it won't go away. It comes through walls. It appears. It's not graspable in the sense that you can say, in this place, that we know this is going to be the winner. It's going to be this message of faith, but it also just remains. It doesn't go away. It's not dead. You can't kill it. I think that is such a beautiful story for me of what resurrection means, of this sort of life breaking out, and why Jesus is right to say you can let go. It's okay. You can let go. God will carry the rest. This won't be forgotten. Death is not the end. And I don't even mean this in the sort of afterlife sense, but there's like the history of goodness is not erasable.
Yep. And the little birds. What is it? Like every little bird is known, or something like that.
Yeah.
Right. That's that sense that it counts. The good things count.
Mm-hmm.
So, Leah, have we helped?
You might have destroyed one of my points, but maybe you've slightly made it up, and I'll work around it.
Oh dear.
Yeah, no, I think, I was going in the same direction, so that's cool.
So you made those points through us.
Yeah, I was kind of leading you along.
You were leading us in the right direction.
Didn't know. You didn't know what was happening. That's I think the hard thing about turning up to do a talk at church is that just that sense that so many people arrive in so many different places, don't they? So, for some people this stuff is top of mind, and oh my goodness, the world's awful, and they're frustrated if it's not kind of mentioned in church. And for other people, they've got so much going on in their own private lives that this is just
another downer, yeah.
Just another, So sometimes I feel like you don't want to turn up and be down because you want to try and encourage people. But we have ended somewhere positive, and I think my talk does too. So,
and I think it's always good to remember that you just bring the little that you have, and it may help some and not others. That's why we have different preachers.
Yeah, exactly.
And you feel called to wrestle with this passage in a particular way that's authentic to how you see the world. And you're not alone in that. It won't be everybody, but you're not alone.
And I always find it helps me thinking of it. Gives me a focus to my thoughts if I'm trying to prepare a talk.
Oh, definitely.
Rather than just worrying about work the whole time.
Definitely, yeah.
It's something else to think about.
Keeps me in the faith is to have to think about these things and actually work out how you feel about them, because so many times you just kind of let them go. And
I guess that is one of the things about the Bible, isn't it? That if it was a really straightforward text that you could just go, oh yeah, that means that. And but it's the fact that you have to come and wrestle with it and go, well, yeah.
What are you saying, Leah?
I'd rather that wasn't in there. There's bits that you wish they weren't there, aren't there?
Yes.
But
All right. Well, thank you very much for sharing your notes with us, which I found really helpful. And thank you, Jörg and Leah, for sharing this conversation. Listener, I hope you enjoyed it, and we hope that you have thoughts that you would like to share with us as well. So if anything that we talked about sparked a thought in you, we would love to hear from you. There's an email address and various other things in the show notes, and we'd love to hear from you. Maybe if we know you, maybe we'll bump into you. We can start a conversation there as well. So thanks very much. Thanks, Jörg. Thanks, Leah. And see you next time.
Bye.
You've been listening to Justice Warriors. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and you can also follow us on social media by searching for Justice Warriors, where warrior is spelt like someone who worries about things. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a rating, since that helps other people find us. Also, please tell your friends about us in real life. We'd love to hear from you. To get in touch, use the email address in the show notes or contact us via the social media links. Thanks for listening.
And now you do what they told you. And now you do what they told you.